together, we are all the curators, we're the guardians, we're the lucky participants in this great human enterprise called literature, called poetry, which has been going on since the beginning of humanity. And if we're good enough, it will go on into the future.
Welcome, everyone, to Crazy Good Turns, a podcast that recognizes and celebrates people who do crazy good things for others. I'm your host, Frank Blake, and my co-host today is Maggie Bailey. Welcome, Maggie.
Hi.
I am really looking forward to this episode. Our guest today is Dana Gioia. To say that he is an accomplished poet is a huge understatement. He has published 5 collections of poetry, was awarded the American Book Award, was chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, and the list of his awards and accomplishments, well, it just goes on and on. Over this past holiday, I read his most recent book, Studying with Miss Bishop, Memoirs from a Young Writer's Life. I'm embarrassed to say that before reading the book, I wasn't familiar with Mr. Gioia, or Miss Bishop for that matter, but the book is simply brilliant. I know nothing about poetry, and I loved it. It is, in my view, a profound thank you to teachers and anyone who can express that kind of thoughtful gratitude has done the world a crazy good turn. I think you're going to love this show. I know you'll love his book. We're going to give away 100 copies, which we'll give you the details on at the end of the podcast. And by the way, I've asked Maggie to be our co-host today because she does know something about poetry. She's a published poet herself, and she's also my daughter. It is an honor to have Dana Gioia on the show. Welcome, Dana.
I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be here with your daughter, a fellow poet.
Thank you. Dana, I'd like to start where your book starts. In your preface, you say that the book conveys your gratitude to the writers you met. What prompted you to take all that effort and write such a great, extended thank you?
I think it's really a combination of 2 things. One was gratitude, because it was my good luck, my blessing to have encountered these people when I needed them. But secondly, it was to explain myself and I think explain my generation to the future, because I have already become, at 70, a historical artifact. I was born into a world which, in some ways no longer exists, especially a literary world that no longer exists. And I realized when I would be, talking to my students, because I taught for the last 9 years. I retired about a year ago from the University of Southern California, where they created a chair called poetry and public culture that I held. When I'd explain to my students, there was a kind of barrier to them in terms of where their experience was and where my experience was. And so the book was, in a sense, a loving recreation of the world of my childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, which took the form, really, of discussing 6 people who were instrumental in me recognizing my own creative path in life. And I do believe that most people have a couple of people, if you're lucky you have more than a couple of people, who you met at just the right time, and they guided you, usually through positive things. Sometimes it's somebody who's so bad they have kind of a negative example. And I have one of those people in my book, who very talented, a sort of genius, but who was also destructive. And I think that when I read most memoirs nowadays, and I like to read memoirs, so often they're about payback. They're about these people that they have a grudge against, and I'm going to blow the lid off this person, and I'm going to strip this person, of their illusions. And I didn't want to write that kind of a book, because I think we learn most effectively through love. And in fact, I think we have a kind of love affair with our great teachers, and we open ourselves up to them, they open themselves up to us, and there's a kind of exchange that goes on that you can't have without affection. So gratitude and, in a sense, storytelling are the two reasons that I wrote the book.
Can I ask, with that in mind, when you sort of sat down, was it hard to winnow it to those 6? Or did you say, ding, 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 ding?
It was impossible. It was impossible. Because this book took me many years to write. And in fact, most of the sections I published another version of, usually smaller, more awkward. And I find it very difficult to write about myself. And there's 2 reasons. First of all, I know too much about myself. And secondly, you don't really care that much. What you care about my stories are those stories which have value to you. What I found really difficult was to bring my whole life, or the whole creative portion of my life, down to these 6 chapters, and then inside the chapter find out what would be not just of interest to me, but of interest to us. And the big revelation I've had as a writer, as a poet and as a prose writer, and it happened gradually in the course of my career, was that I realized writing is not about me. Poetry is not about me. It's about creating us. It's about creating a relationship with the reader where you converse with the reader as an equal. And this is the hard thing. I allow the reader to bring his or her whole life into my book. And I think that's what happened with you, Frank. We don't know each other. We have certain similarities in our background, but not a lot. But I think I created a room that was so big that you could bring your whole life in there and your life fit.
I would say it's very extraordinary. I didn't really know Miss Bishop. And your book so opened up. That room analogy is such a great analogy, because then afterwards I go, oh, okay. And then I started reading some of her poetry, and it's just so well done.
Well, thank you. I should probably say that since the people were listening to us have not seen the book probably, is that one chapter is about myself as a kid, and it's about having an uncle who was a kind of working class intellectual who had filled my parents' apartment full of books, and then he was killed in a plane crash. The family just inherited all these books that were highly intellectual that my parents didn't throw away. So I was him, and we have Elizabeth Bishop. Then we have John Cheever, very famous fiction writer. James Dickey, a famous fiction writer and poet. People who have seen Deliverance. The movie Deliverance is based on his novel. And then Robert Fitzgerald, who was an incredible teacher I had at Harvard. And then the final chapter is about a completely forgotten poet, a poet that no one has ever heard of. And it's about how many people, and this is true not just in poetry, but if you're any kind of an artist, musicians, painters, sculptors who just have had no success at all. And some of them give up, but some of them just keep working. But you feel a kind of heartbreak, for them, because they have not, in a sense, been able to create that conversation I'm talking about. I've been lucky as a writer, almost from the first, I've had readers. And so I've always felt there was a conversation. It's gotten larger as I've gotten more established. But that human relationship is something that is really important to an artist, I think.
Now, I'm biased on this, obviously, having been in the business world, still am in the business world, but I love the fact that you were vice president of marketing at General Foods, and that, your first part of your career, you weren't a poet per se. What part of that experience proved helpful, if anything?
I wanted to be a poet. I was in graduate school at Harvard studying to get a PhD in literature, and I realized that what I wanted to do was to write, not to be an academic intellectual, not to be a literary theorist. So I left, and then I tried to figure out, what do I do? So I ended up going into business, which was an extraordinarily valuable thing for me. And it was valuable for me in 3 ways. First of all, I'm a poor kid. I'm a working class kid. I'm the oldest kid in the family, first kid to go to college. And I had a lot of financial obligations to my family to help my siblings through there. So it paid the bills. Secondly, and this is so important, it put me in a world that wasn't full of academics. that wasn't full of English professors. You get these people that in a faculty that talk to each other and talk to their students, and they lose their ability to talk across classes, talk across professions. And in fact, I have people in the English department tell me all the time, well, there's people outside are not really smart enough, to read poetry. They're not really smart. And you got to say, I hate to tell you, but human intelligence is not centered in the English department. The people I worked with at General Foods were smart, they were quick, they were creative, perhaps not in the way that academics define those things, but these were people that solved enormously complicated problems and brought a kind of positive energy to the things they were in. And that was really important for me. So for 15 years, I was with people who spoke English the way that the general population speaks English. And I could see what interested them and what didn't interest them. Now, the third thing is that I kept the fact that I wrote absolutely secret. Because, once again, Frank, I don't know about you, but when I started in the business world, it was a very militaristic kind of environment. You took orders from people, it was hierarchical, you did it the way the company told you to do it. And I realized that if they knew I was a poet, they would kind of start checking my math. Because they just, they would not have trusted me. And I was in a very analytical, very numbers-driven company. And so it was very good for me to be private about my writing for years. I didn't have to make a living off it. I didn't have to get an academic promotion off it. I didn't have to publish if I didn't want to. And I could perfect it in private. I'm also... I'm a Catholic. I'm a religious person. I like to think, a very real spiritual life. And it allowed the poetry to go into that part of my mind and my soul. There's a novelist named Anthony Burgess. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He wrote Clockwork Orange, very famous. And I got a job to interview him. Actually, I was in business, so I took the day off. And I was supposed to just have breakfast with Burgess, but Burgess liked me, so we ended up spending the entire day together in the St. Regis bar. At one point, he says, "Well, you're not a business person. What do you really do?" I said, "Well, I'm actually a poet." And his eyes lit up, and he said, "I write novels. I write them for readers." He said, "But if you're a poet, you write for God." And I thought it was a really interesting metaphor. Because what he was, Burgess was an ex-Catholic or kind of, quasi-Catholic. But I think what he's really telling me, if you're writing for God, you're writing for somebody you can't lie to, somebody who knows you, somebody who sees through all of your illusions. And so the only thing that you can do, in a sense, writing for God, is to bring him your best self forward. Without any of the everyday lies with which you lead. And so I think I was able to do that by writing in private. And then after a number of years, I began to publish again. And I immediately went from not publishing at all to publishing in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Hudson Review. Really the best places in the country. And that rose another problem because then people at work discovered I was a poet. And I have a little one-page anecdote about that, which sums up the entire corporate response to that.
All right. Well, no. Please share that with the audience.
I was working for a brilliant, brutal guy. And he'd been a Marine. He'd gone to the Naval Academy. He'd been an All-American in 2 sports. Absolutely had a military view of these things. And so Esquire magazine had this feature called Men and Women Under 40 Who Are Changing America. And they decided to pick me as one of their people. And I told them I didn't want to be picked, which is kind of odd, but I didn't want to be picked because I realized that people would know that I was a poet. And they said, it's not your choice to be picked or not. We pick the people. Here I am with Whoopi Goldberg and Bill Clinton and people like this. And so it came out, and then suddenly somebody brought it into the office, and within, by the end of the morning, everybody knew it. So this guy called me in, and he looked kind of like, if you know the Marvel comics, Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos, and he always had a cigar. And so I came in there, and he takes the cigar stub out of his mouth. He looks up at me. He goes, he referred to everybody by their initials, by the way. He goes, DG. I said, yeah, Greg? Somebody told me you were a poet. Is that true? And I said, yeah, it is. And he just said, shit. And that was all he said. It was like he never wanted to hear any more about that again. It was a grave embarrassment to him and our team. But that was the old corporate world. Nowadays, I think it's probably a lot different.
If I could ask a question sort of coming off of that, I didn't go straight into an MFA program. I did my MFA program later once I'd established my own career, and I did it in the summers. So I didn't have that sort of traditional MFA experience. And one of the things I loved that you mentioned in the Cheever chapter was saying that he was talking about how a real writer could live an ordinary life. And I think of when we think of poets and MFA programs, we think of something very sort of separated and sort of set up in gauze over here. Here are the poets all living with the poets in a cabin in the woods and having bad feelings, as opposed to, you know, this image that you present of poets as like fully engaged in the ordinary work of life. And so I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little more about that tension between poetry as sort of engaged in the world versus poetry as like a set aside.
Well, you said it all so beautifully. I'm not sure how much more I can add, but my parents, what I would say, poor folk or plain folk. But, you know, I came from plain folk, and they were good folk. My mother never had much education. She was a brilliant woman. You know, my cousins were always in trouble, but they were bright guys. And when I ended up at Stanford, then I ended up at Harvard, there was this assumption I was given to that we were the elite of the country. And okay, we were in some measurable ways, but that doesn't mean that we are fundamentally different from the people that we come from or fundamentally people that are around us. And so I always felt that I wanted to write a kind of poem that appealed simultaneously to two audiences. I wanted to be able to show it to my fellow poets and have them say, yeah, this is really good. This is well made. You know, the way that, you know, my Uncle Giacomo was a cabinet maker. And when he made a piece of furniture, you know, the other carpenters would come around and they just go, you know, Jack, you really know how to build these things, you know. But he wasn't building it for the carpenters. He was building it for a person to bring into their house and make it part of their daily life. And so I wanted to write poems, and I could not have explained this well when I was young, but I want to write poems that are useful for people's life. Now, the whole word useful, an academic would go, oh my God, you're condescending. No, I mean, you know, human beings go through these very complicated experiences that we call life. It's up and down, all these other things. And poetry is actually one of humanity's coping mechanisms. It gives us the stories, the images, the languages, the ideas, the emotional descriptions by which we learn to live our lives. That's why kids need poetry, why kids need literature. And any educational system which doesn't believe this is making a dreadful mistake. Because part of what you have to do in education is not simply educate the kid's mind, but educate the kid's emotions. You know, we know that physical education, you have to educate their bodies, but you have to give kids the ability to kind of inhabit emotions that they've not experienced in their lives yet. To try those emotions out, so when death, when war, when sickness, when distress, when defeat, all these things happen to you, you have an imaginative preparation. You're not caught entirely by surprise. And so, as a poet, I want, in a sense, to write poems which are beautiful and are true. What you're trying to do is to create a verbal spell in poetry, the music of poetry, which grabs people's attention, allows them to kind of focus on it, to relax their defenses, and then have some kind of human transaction. I don't feel the humanity in a lot of contemporary poetry. I see the trends, I see the novelty, whatever the key idea of the moment is, but it's all this prefabricated stuff that's going on. Whereas and this is what makes literature important, I think, in the kind of age we're in, is that literature is still, how do I put this, an art about only two people, the writer and the reader, the speaker and the listener. It creates an intimate kind of one-on-one relationship, and versus a mass relationship, where I watch television and they're talking to you as a group, as a consumer subsegment, perhaps, if they've targeted you. And I'm not saying that kind of communication doesn't have its use, but what we do need is to be recognized that we go through our lives as an individual person in our individual body, in a particular place, in a particular time. And that is the paramount reality of our existence. And that what literature does is allow you to link up with one other person for an instant, for the instant of reading or listening, who is in their particularity of existence. And it gives us a vantage point, a point to compare, a point to share. And if you lose that intimacy, if you lose that individuality, then we lose a capacity of what it means to be human.
One of the things that I find so powerful about your vision as you share it is that specificity requires both sort of like an openness, but also technical mastery, right? Like what's going to make the poem sing, and the person who isn't paying attention isn't even going to notice it. But if you scratch at it, you're going to see that structure, that attention to language, the meter, all those things. And I loved the description of Fitzgerald's grading system, when it was like, and it took me a minute.
I didn't explain it. in the book because I thought it'd be more fun for people to figure it out.
Absolutely. So if I was right, it was not at all bad or not all.
Yeah, he had PB, NTB, NB, and his highest grade was NAAB. So PB was pretty bad. Then not too bad. And then not bad. And then the highest grade you could get was not at all bad.
That was the highest grade?
Yeah. And it was a good thing because it said that, in a students writing poems, you don't look for goodness. You look for the absence of errors. And so, but it is true. One of the great mistakes we make in teaching poetry nowadays is we don't teach craft. It's a condescension that, I'll just let you pretend your stuff is good. Because I don't want to criticize it. I don't want to do the heavy lifting of actually teaching you. But poetry, like carpentry, like medicine and surgery, like economics, like accounting, like any of these higher function forms of communication, and accounting is a kind of communication, is a communication which poets are customarily terrible at. What you're trying to do as a poet is to learn the weight and the value of every word, to learn the meaning of every rhythm, to learn the power of images. And it takes, like any other profession, you've got to handle the material. You've got to work in the material. If you're running a Home Depot, first time as a manager, you're going to make all kinds of mistakes. You have something you think is a really good idea till you see it work. And actually, poetry is a little like management in this, is that you have a great idea, but your employees just don't get it. They go, why does he want us to do this? Now, sometimes it's because they don't understand, but more often it's because, it just doesn't translate. And so what you're doing as a poet is, and this is the hard part, is saying, well, this image means this to me, but what does it mean to a stranger? And so what you're learning as a poet is, in a sense, to write in a way where you can be heard as you intend to speak. There's a thing that singers do. In Italian, it's called suffragio. In French, it's called soufflage, which is also the English word. And you spend a couple of hours a day where you see a note on on a score and then you sing it, or somebody sings it to you and you can tell them what note it's singing. And what you're doing is you are not just training, but you are internalizing eye, ear, voice coordination until it becomes, you can immediately hear when somebody's off key. You can, with somebody, it's like everything, you see these jazz musicians, they go, all the things you are, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they start playing, but they don't tell anybody what key they're playing in. And so everybody has to hear from the very first note that's played what key they're in. And it's, it's the kind of training where you've internalized it all. And so that's what you have to do as a poet. You have to do it where, you can write a poem where the words carry all kinds of meanings. I mean, there's a poem. I'll give you an example. I don't think it's a poem of mine you've read called "Pity the Beautiful."
Please.
Yeah, it's very short. It's very and it has a deep personal story behind it. Something happened in my life that was heartbreaking. Somebody I'd known for years, a woman of extraordinary beauty. I discovered she had died early, and she was so beautiful, any guy would just offer to do anything for her. And so she had a life where people took care of her. And what happens to those kinds of people is that when their beauty fades, there's nobody there to take care of them, and they don't really know how to take care of themselves. And I discovered she died. She had been in drugs and things. I hadn't seen her for years. She was a wonderful, funny, warm human person. But I didn't want to put that in a poem. I didn't want it to be about me. So I tried to say, how do I make this work? And at the same time, there was a composer, Helen Sung, a jazz pianist, who wanted to do some albums and wanted me to write lyrics for her. So I wrote this poem, and I wanted it to be slightly funny until the end. And it's called Pity the Beautiful. Pity the beautiful, the dolls and the dishes, the babes with big daddies, granting their wishes. Pity the pretty boys, the hunks and Apollos, the golden lads whom success always follows, the hotties, the knockouts, the 10s out of 10, the drop-dead gorgeous, the great leading men. Pity the faded, the bloated, the blousy, the paunchy Adonis whose luck's gone lousy. Pity the gods, no longer divine. Pity the night, the stars lose their shine.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. But I wanted a poem that anybody could understand. And and the same way, that's why I put all the slang in it. And I put some slang from my dad's generation, from my generation, and from my kids' generation to show you that what I was talking about is always there.
It's also such a great reminder of the oral power, the listening power of poetry.
When you have a good reader, particularly.
Well, that's also a poem that needed to be rhymed. Half my poems don't rhyme. Maybe 2/3 of my poems don't rhyme. But some poems need to be rhymed because what I'm trying to do is just create a little spell there about these beautiful people. I mean, this is a very LA poem. These people that can live on their beauty. The babes with big daddies, granting their wishes. And babe and big daddy were slightly out of usage when I wrote the poem. Actually, they're now back in usage, unfortunately, such is our time.
I'm curious, with the students nowadays, would you be able to give them an equivalent grade of not at all bad and have them internalize that in a way, or is that just so they just can't conceive of somebody saying, well, that's not at all bad?
At USC, I was a demanding teacher. I was a tough grader. I made them work. But in a way that they enjoyed. And the reason I felt I was doing them a disservice to simply not be demanding. That these were people who would go farther in life if I developed, encouraged, and refined their ability to deal with language. And they recognized that. They recognized that I was giving them life skills. My first class and my next to last class were about what poetry meant actually in their lives, why this was as important as economics or biology or anything else about in terms of defining themselves and their place in the world. But I think if we condescend to our students, if we cheat our students, if we don't ask them to put their best efforts forward. And it's sad because I think in general, their students today are cheated. People graduate only half educated, and the rest of their life, I think, there's a certain loss that they experience because of that.
Loss or fear. Like if you've never been able to see that the pretty bad is the price you pay to get past it, then the first pretty bad you get can really knock you out of the game. And, I think that was one of the things that I so appreciated about your book is that it comes from a place of celebration and gratitude.
As poets, we all start at PB. Pretty bad. In fact, some of us maybe start at B, just bad. What education should be, what life should be, is a continual process of self-transcendence. And we should always try, in a sense, to build from our previous selves, to improve ourselves. And I mean that intellectually, I mean that behaviorally, I mean that spiritually. And the great lives that you lead are refinements. And this is why people need literature, because again and again, life brings you to an impasse. And you have to imagine your next step. You have to imagine your next life. When you have a defeat in life, you have, in a sense, to imagine. And it's so an education which does not feed your creativity and your imagination is not allowing you to lead a life in a society like ours. I mean, it's no longer that, your father's a carpenter, you're a carpenter. Everybody now in America has to invent their life not once, but again and again and again. And so, we've all had to reinvent our lives with COVID. We've had to, reinvent our lives at each step. And even when you retire, even if you have a pension, you then have to reimagine what is the next step of your life, unless you just want to vegetate. And so I think that, the powers of literature have not been explained. The way that academics talk about what they're doing is so remote from the human needs of their own students that it is shocking. And indeed, you could say it's irresponsible. They've got these intellectual, political things that they're doing, that are absolutely abstract from the needs of their students. One of the things I would do in class, I would say, how many of you, and I had 200 people in this class, how many of you are the first person in your family to go to college? Have all these hands go up. How many of you have parents who speak a foreign language? Hands would go up. And ask a couple of questions like this, and I say, you are the vessels for your families to go into the future. And what we need to do is to guide those vessels, make them strong, that they can survive storms, that they can lead the rest of the family. And people understood that. They understood what poetry meant for that, how a command of language, which doesn't mean just speaking language, it means the skill you get in hearing language, in analyzing language from poetry. So anyway, I considered what I did at USC as a kind of very, very high level sort of human intervention in the educational system, which is to, in a sense, get these people to bring the ideas and powers of great literature into their minds.
This is probably not a kind question, but I'll start by saying one of the things that's amazing is just the breadth of your experience. And as people, you were also the head of the NEA. So my unkind question is, who are more vicious? Faculty, professors, or politicians?
Well, they are really, in contention, I think, for that title. Politicians tend to be smoother at it. The thing I noticed about academic arguments is that people would pass each other in absolute silence. They wouldn't, they would hold back. Where politicians, they'll be anything but silent. When I went to Washington, people say, fight the fight, save the NEA, fight the good fight. And the more people that told me this, I realized that fighting was the wrong metaphor. My job was to go there and not fight. My job, and they would say, how can you deal with that person? And I said, I have no enemies. I have my friends, and I have the people who will become my friends. And if you come into a person with the determination that the two of you are going to find some common ground, you'd be surprised, at how much you could accomplish. I took some meetings just so a congressman or a senator could yell at me. And then once they sort of, they turned red in the face and everything else, you'd start to talk to them. And honest to God, I remember once a very famous politician, I won't name him, but a name you all know. And he just hated the NEA, hated everything about it. And so at the end of his thing, I said, well, I don't disagree with you. You're half right. And he says, I'm entirely right. I said, no, you're half right, which is a half truth, which means it isn't true. And so I said, so he canceled his next meeting just so he could argue with me more. And we talked, but he realized I was listening to him and this, that, and the other. And in the end, he just said, well, I like you, but I'm still not going to vote for the increase. And I said, and then I surprised him. I said, Senator, I will never ask you to vote against your conscience. I said, my job is to make your conscience tell you that supporting me is the best thing for your own constituents. And it was the only time in his entire career he didn't have a comeback. About 6 months later, I passed him in the corridor of the Senate office. He says, Chairman Gioia, I held my nose, but I voted for your budget. And so you can do it. So I was able to build a bipartisan majority in both houses, and I was able to get an increase for the NEA every year I was there. But I did it not by fighting, but in a sense by, demonstrating my partnership with them.
There's a great line from Abraham Lincoln on the point you're just making, where Abraham Lincoln is quoted as saying, I don't like that man. I need to get to know him better. That's the core of it.
Well, the funny thing about politicians, and this is where I think they differ in some ways from a lot of English professors. The one thing all politicians have in common is that they like people. They are the ultimate, people person, sometimes pathologically, people persons.
All right, Maggie, a last question.
I have a joke with my friends from my MFA program. The girls I lived with were all fiction writers. And the joke about the poets was that the collective noun for poets is an insecurity of poets. Because when you kind of get too many poets in a room, there's sort of this stress around, who's going to win the prize or who's the prom king of the day or who's gotten into the latest, workshop at the place with the thing. And I think that the generosity of your book is a great move against that nervous energy. And I was just wondering who's a poet now, maybe like a student that you've had or a young up and coming poet that you're sort of excited about from that standpoint of generosity rather than thinking in terms of, laurels.
I'll answer that, but I want to address something you said earlier. I guarantee you 10 years from now, it's going to be an insecurity of novelists, an insecurity of everything, because the arts world has a kind of win-lose mentality. You get the prize, I don't. You get the grant, I don't. And the one thing I learned in business was to create a win-win environment where we win together. And so very early on in my dealings with fellow poets, because I've created 2 writers' conferences, I've helped with presses, is to try to cultivate an atmosphere which is a win-win, where we work with each other in the spirit of collegiality, of friendship, and to love, not to put too fine a word on it, that we emphasize those positive things, which means there are some kinds of people that you can't bring into that environment because they're too contaminated with the kind of competitiveness and negativity. And I know very famous writers who honestly are depressed all the time because somebody else is winning the prize. I mean, they write you daily about some new indignity, which is, so-and-so didn't give me this, and you just relax. So I have tried in my career to help people who I think are especially worthy people. I was the first person ever to review to write an essay on a solo piece on a completely unknown poet named Kay Ryan. I came across this book, and I explained how accidentally I came across this book, and I said it's as good as any book I've read for years. And now she's won the Pulitzer Prize. She was poet laureate, and Kay Ryan is our Emily Dickinson. But and I also, not only did I do that, I put her in my anthologies, and I contacted other people and said, you have to put her in your anthologies. And so now Kay is actually a few years older than me. So was I her mentor? Not in the least. Did I influence her style? Not in the least. But I did give her the breakthrough, I think people know this, that I was the one in Washington who got her appointed poet laureate. I was the one who lobbied with the Library of Congress and said, this is the person you need to appoint. A younger poet that I met at the beginning of her career, and I gave her a little bit of help. Once again, her own genius is responsible. I was not a stylistic mentor. Is a woman named A.E. Stallings. At certain points in her career, I happened to be in the place where I could do something that made a huge difference for her. Alicia is her name. Alicia is as good as you get. And so I don't take any credit, but what I do say is that I've helped, and I think it's very important even to help the gifted, because somebody like Kay Ryan was completely marginalized. Nobody even recognized her name and things like this. There was a long story. I wrote an essay called The Catholic Writer Today, and all these letters came into the magazine, and there was a fellow who seemed slightly tormented, and he was a PhD, he was unemployed, he had 2 kids, and so naturally, what does he do? He creates a press, so you go, and so, I started talking to him, and I said, this guy is absolutely dedicated, he's an absolutely pure artist, and so I decided I was going to help the press. I gave him money, I raised money for him, because I feel like that's giving back. And so, I've done this in a lot of ways. I mean, I've started recently. I don't write blurbs anymore, but I have written prefaces. I'll say, well, if I like your book enough, I'll write a preface for it. So you actually have a critical article. It's a guy named James Matthew Wilson. I've done it for a fellow named Aaron Pachigian. I've done it for, and I believe it's very important to help people. But the main thing I did in my career in that regard was to create the Westchester Writers Conference, which is still going on, although I'm not involved with it anymore. But for 25 years, it was a place where people came from all over the country. And the moment they walked in the door, they realized it was different from other conferences. It exemplified my values. So I do think that, because I think that it's the natural thing for artists to feel like they're getting a short end of the stick, that they don't get enough. They do all this work. They labor in obscurity. And so the least you can do as a fellow writer is not to make their lives worse, and to give them a sense that together we are all the curators, we're the guardians, we're the lucky participants in this great human enterprise called literature, called poetry, which has been going on since the beginning of humanity. And if we're good enough, it will go on into the future.
Wow. Dana, what a privilege and honor it has been just to be able to talk to you for an hour. I'm going to end with one last question for our listeners now who are going to be going, this was amazing. How do I learn more about him? Where should I go? What is the answer to that?
Well, my younger son is a filmmaker, and so he's done a number of YouTubes with me. There's some of poetry. He's recorded 10 different talks And what I'm trying to do is just share my poems for people who are not literary people, who like to listen to one poem, for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and then to have lectures that are very accessible, a lot of visuals for a general audience, people that want to know about poetry, want to hear about it in a responsible way, but don't know, what else to do. So just go to, just do Dana Gioia. Now, spelling my name is an accomplishment, but if you put a link on your website, just Dana Gioia, I have a little channel on YouTube. There's about 20 things on it, and they're not too scary.
That's fantastic. It has been, as I say, an absolute delight. The wisdom in this conversation is stunning, and I know everybody who's listening. What a privilege for them.
Well, what they're going to hear is that all three of us had fun.
Yes,
we all had fun, and that's good.
All have fun, and honestly, it was interesting, Dana, because I loved your book. So wanted you to participate in this podcast, and now thrilled that both I had that idea and that you were willing to do this, and also to get my daughter participating as well. What a treat!
Well, great to meet her, and thank you for sharing my book with people. That's a great gesture of generosity.
Wow, that was great getting the chance to talk with Dana Gioia. I hope you enjoyed that. He's an outstanding writer, and as you can tell, a really thoughtful and wonderful human being. And Maggie, thank you for participating as a co-host. That was a treat.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think it was mainly a treat for me, firstly as a poet to have a chance to speak face-to-face with Dana Gioia via Zoom. And it just exceeded all my expectations to meet sort of one of our great poets of America. And then, personally as a daughter, I've grown up my life talking with you about the importance of generosity and community and the power of what literature can accomplish kind of in our lives and in our hearts. And so to hear that expounded upon and sort of discussed with Dana Gioia, I thought just added a new dimension to that conversation. And it was awesome. You're still my favorite, but he's coming up. He's edging up, Dad. So just watch out.
All right. Well, thank you. That's terrific. And wow, thank you for those comments. We'll ask you back to be a co-host again. And I hope all of you enjoyed the conversation with Dana. And I hope you will take the time to sign up for our random distribution of 100 free copies of his book. It is a great book. Please go to crazygoodturns.org/Dana. That's DANA. crazygoodturns.org/Dana to sign up for our random gift of 100 books of his terrific book of Studying with Miss Bishop. It is, I enjoyed it, and I know you will as well. Thank you, as always, to our terrific production team of Stephen Key, Megan Hanlon from Pen Name, and Score. And I look forward to talking with you all again. Bye-bye.